Call the Honourable the Assistant Treasurer.
Government's the problem.
Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, after being KO'd last night by Alan Jones on Q&A, here comes Disco Chris into the chamber to show us how he's forgotten the last 6 years of chaos function on the Labor side. Who remembers that famous saying, that famous statement that chills the bones of every Labor member? The 4 years of surpluses I announced tonight.
Who said that?
Who said that? The member for Lilly. The member for Lilly was so good at his job that it quickly went to the member for McMahon. Who remembers that? We certainly remember that on our side, because if you talk about false hopes, if you talk about expectations that are never met, that is the best example of that. And the member for McMahon knows so much that he's texting the member for Lilly just to check that it is true. Now, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, the members on this side know two things. The members on this side know two things. First, they know what a failure the Labor side was, and secondly, they know how significant our achievements have been in less than a year and a half in office. And they know we are not shirking the challenge of budget repair. We are not shirking that challenge of budget repair because we know that if we do so, we will be as bad as you in that game of intergenerational theft. The game that you left a bill of $25,000 for every man, woman and child in Australia as a result of your debt bill. So let's remember, when those opposite inherited the Australian balance sheet, there was zero government debt. And when we inherited, we were fast on a trajectory of $667 billion of debt, of an interest bill of $1 billion a month. And as the Treasurer has pointed out to this House, we are now borrowing and spending $100 million a day more than we are taking as revenue. And $40 million of that $100 million is just going to the interest payments on Labor's debt bill. That is the legacy that have left us. In addition to 400,000 jobs being lost in small business, a rotisserie of small business ministers, 6 in just the same number of years. What about the pink bats and the school halls fiasco? So far, everyone seems to forget what a job we have done in stopping the boats. Not only did we save thousands of lives at sea, but also we saved the taxpayer over $10 billion, because that would have been the bill if it was business as usual as it occurred under Labor's watch. Of course, they gave us a mining tax, which was expected to produce $26.5 billion in revenue. And you know what it produced in revenue? Just over $300 million, less than 3% of the expectation, after the ATO had spent $50 million in administering it. They gave us a carbon tax, which was a hit on the average Australian family of $550 a year. They reduced defence spending to its lowest level since 1938. They took money, as the Foreign Minister has reminded us, from the aid budget to help fill the gap in their border protection policies. And of course, on the NBN, they turned what should have been a nation-building project into an expensive white elephant, which was out of time and out of budget. So that is the record, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, of those opposite. And of course, we came to government, the adults were back in charge, and we commissioned a commission of audit where we got a respected businessman in Tony Shepherd to tell us what really needed to be done. And he laid out a blueprint for reform. And the hard reform was to bridge that structural deficit, the gap between spending and receipts that this Labor opposition had left us after their time in government. And he pointed out that in Australia we face an ageing population, where currently we have 5 working Australians to every single retired Australian. But by mid this century, that ratio will fall from 5 to 1 to 2.7 to 1. And we can't afford to have health spending go from $8 billion 10 years ago for Medicare to $20 billion today to $34 billion in just a few years' time, when only half of that $20 billion is coming from the Medicare levy. We just can't afford the increasing cost of an ageing population without tightening our belts and without getting smaller and more efficient government. So what have we done? We've done exactly that. As a result of our reforms, the government's debt will be $170 billion less than it would have been under Labor in 10 years' time. The interest bill will be significantly lower, so more money can be spent on roads, more money can be spent on hospitals, more money can be spent on schools. And of course, we've gone on with the job of microeconomic reform, particularly deregulation, taking 57,000 pages out of our statute books, significantly reducing the red tape burden for small business and for big business alike, and for the not-for-profit sector. Getting $1 billion a year of red tape reductions was something that those opposite thought was impossible, but in fact we more than doubled that with more than $2 billion of red tape achievements being reached. Infrastructure, we got the largest infrastructure spending projects on record underway as a result of the $50 billion stimulus in last year's budget, and an asset recycling plan which incentivises the states to take those decisions to sell existing infrastructure and reinvest in new infrastructure. But no surprises, those opposite block our attempts to reboot the Australian economy, to boost supply by investing in appropriate infrastructure. That is what we tried to do. And on top of that, the member for Goldstein has been heroic in his efforts to get 3 free trade agreements. Those 3 free trade agreements will be the bedrock of this Australian economy in the years to come, because they lock us in to the growth economies on our doorstep, to China, to Japan, and of course to Korea. 3 of our largest export partners, with China being our #1 trading partner with $150 billion a year of two-way trade. And of course, we are not stopping. Indonesia and India are also where we're going. And as a result of these free trade agreements, things that stayed in the Labor Party's in-tray for way too long and were never dotted, the I's were never dotted and the T's crossed, we have achieved that. And as a result, our dairy exporters, our beef exporters, our resources producers, our service providers, because 70% of the Australian economy is services, but only 17% of our exports are services, they will all benefit. That is going to be a result of the initiatives that were underway. Now, the members opposite try to say that the Australian economy is not going well. Well, I can tell you the Australian economy is strong and is sound and is improving under our watch. Just consider this. In last year, growth was 2.7% compared to 1.9% under Labor. Job advertising levels are now at their highest in over 2 years. Over 200,000 jobs were created on our watch, which equates to 600 new jobs every day. The Dun & Bradstreet Business Expectations Survey, released on the 3rd of February this year, found that the outlook on employment is the most positive it has been in 10 years. Australia's retail trade numbers have now risen for 7 consecutive months to be 4.1% higher through the year. And of course, the 4-week average of the ANZ Consumer Confidence Index sits around its long-term average levels. And last year, there were 223,000 new companies registered in Australia, which was an increase of 10.2% from the levels we saw in 2013. Dwelling approvals are also up 8.8% higher than last year. This is a very good story. And when you combine that story, Mr Deputy Speaker, with the fact that we've just had an interest rate cut by 25 basis points, which for an average family with a $300,000 mortgage will mean $750 extra into their pockets. When you combine that with the fact that petrol prices are the lowest levels in many, many years, and as a result the average Australian family will save about $1,000 a year. And when you combine that with the fact that electricity prices are now $550 lower because we have abolished the carbon tax, that is good news for the lowest cost of the for the average standard of living for an average Australian. So that is a good news story. We've got more investment, greater exposure overseas, and the cost of living is coming down. So, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, on this side of the House, we don't just talk, we do. And in our 17 months in office, we have been very proud of the work in budget repair that we have undertaken, been very proud of the infrastructure projects that we have underway. We've been very proud of the free trade agreements that we have secured, been very proud of the deregulation that we have undertaken, and that is all now making its way through the Australian economy in terms of increased job advertisements, jobs being found for people who have previously been unemployed, housing dwellings are up, retail numbers are strong, and at the end of the day, the Australian people look to those opposite and say you never delivered anything in your 6 years of office other than debt and deficit. There is a better way, and it stands with the coalition.